In the last video, we looked at how the baby boomers knew best and brought us a cowboy movie to conclude the Back to the Future trilogy.
This is heavy.
This time, we look at what would be the fate of the Back to the Future franchise in the subsequent years. How does the franchise from the past hold up in the future? And how is the musical, where yours truly would meet the man that helped make the franchise possible to begin with?
Everybody took Doc Brown's advice.
That's me.
Feel free to like and subscribe, and let's find out. If you want to fast forward
To the future.
and just see the musical review, click on the timeline below. However, I implore you to take a trip through history from the past to the future. Ending the trilogy with a cowboy movie was fine. What happened was the 90s happened, and that was the issue. The summer of 1990 came and went. And already audiences were losing interest in a franchise losing its cachet and a story ready to be wrapped up that began in the mid-1980s. ZZ Top's song from the third movie was fine. But commercial rap was now upon us. Huey Lewis and the News in 1985. This was not. The following year, forget it. A strawberry blonde, not ginger man from Indiana, not India. And an Austrian bodybuilder playing a robot. By 91, it was as if the 80s had never even happened.
Vaya con Dios.
Sort of. Then people with gas masks. Then the zibbity bobs. As the 90s progressed, every 2 or 3 years was a different kind of 90s. Example, Beverly Hills 90210, which definitely had one foot stuck in the 80s, took off in around 91-92. Biggest show ever for about 5 seconds. Then by late 93, that show didn't even make sense. There's still younger boomers pretending to be high school kids in the 90s. Old Man Macchio and Boomer J. Fox. The Jewish chick with glasses is actually a few months older than both of them, playing a teenager in the 90s. You're taking the piss, mate, yeah?
I always had to lie about my age.
It's the Zibbity Bobs era. But these lot are trapped in their 1987 white bread suburbia imagery, sort of.
Back to the future.
It was like an unapologetic celebration of white suburbia through the lens of 50s nostalgia and a contemporary portrayal of 80s teenage freedom and flexibility. The 90s became obsessed with being edgy and the inner city and oppressed minorities, social injustices, etc. So much so that by the mid-90s you needed a fresh show like My So-Called Life to tackle a more relevant teenage depiction. Claire Danes was a younger Gen X millennial cusp teenager, a 15-year-old playing a 15-year-old, not a 29-year-old playing a 17-year-old. Her best friend Rayanne was white but damaged, with daddy issues, whose intern best friend was a Dominican black Latino LGBTQIA+.
You're brilliant.
And poor, and whatever else disenfranchised categories. So Rayanne gets to attach herself to him and be oppressed vicariously through association. Rayanne's a genius. Granted, McFly had a chip on his shoulder since his parents were deadbeats, but white suburban deadbeats all the same. And by the end of the film, he fixed all of that anyway. In any event, by the mid-90s, nobody wasn't thinking about the 80s anymore.
Recovered by Trump, rejected by Smith. Here's Troy again.
And thus, by extension, for the most part, nobody wasn't thinking about the Back to the Future movies anymore.
How many kids?
Like, hello, it's the naughty 90s.
It's all about girls going and partying, baby.
Plus, all due respect to the man, Michael J. Fox was the young hotshot kid with the rest of his life ahead of him in the 80s. Then the 90s comes around and he's just a short dude in his 30s. Realistically, what kind of films can you market him in as the star? 80s nostalgia started to get big in the 2000s. But in the last analog pre-digital era, the West wasn't yet culturally bankrupt and thus creatively bankrupt. And thus younger people were still actually having fun. Back to the Future really regained popularity in the 2000s with the new technology of mass-produced DVDs and special features. Now we can relive and explore our childhoods and how the 80s were kind of awesome.
In special edition DVDs.
DVDs were cheaper and more compact than VHSs in the 80s and 90s. Additionally, you now had first-generation millennials, now in their 20s, already realizing reality sucks. It's easier to retreat to an infantilized world of fantasy escapism. You're not going to be be a sexy movie star, rock star, prince or princess, it dawns on you. You're gonna be average at best, and you're gonna have to actually work your ass off just to be average. But you don't really want to do that because you're an entitled lazy piece of shit. Because your self-involved boomer parents, on the one hand, indulged you with helicopter parenting, whilst paradoxically being too preoccupied with their own pursuits of career and happiness to actually parent you like their World War II generation parents parented them. And thus, with the 80s now being 2 decades ago, you're nostalgic for the good old times when you were a wee little whippersnapper watching Marty McFly and the real Jennifer unconditionally, optimistically loving one another, not using and abusing, friend zoning, camera phoning, guest list clubbing one another.
Here my phone. It's the autograph of the 21st century.
No. You're coming to the club this weekend. There's gonna be like booze and girls. Nah, you're right, mate. Gonna watch the Goonies on DVD on the old PS2. No. This ain't the 90s and we ain't Gen Xers. We're this weird new thing called millennials. No. Oh well, fair enough, mate. You stay at home and watch your Back to the Goonies on your PS2. I'm gonna go to the guest list club and spend $1,000 from my student loan so that exotic girls will come and have sexies with me. No.
Don't you wish your girlfriend was wrong like me?
No. And thus,
Back to the future!
which is what this video is about, was the only remedy for premature existential nihilism, as a DVD box set with special features, mind you.
All been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't.
Back to the Future was back in the cultural zeitgeist by the mid-2000s. We learned to love it all over again due to reasons already explained.
All been raised on
DVD.
A 4th movie wasn't going to happen because elephant in the room, Michael J. Fox had contracted Parkinson's, which of course is a tragedy, and I'll just leave it at that.
There's never going to be a Back to the Future Part 4.
Video games were well past Super Mario Brothers. So the time was right. In a nutshell, I personally appreciate the game because it expands the franchise in ways the goofy cartoon failed to do. After the film ended, I always felt shortchanged. I liked the Needles bit, but I wanted more of Marty back in 1985 as a high school senior. His family looked like they've aged about 10 years in the past 24 hours following the first film. The game has those little touches in 1986 with the real Jennifer. That alone was satisfying. We wanted more, but the films had run their course, hence a new medium of storytelling, i.e. an episode adventure game. The game is essentially the sequel.
Become assholes or something?
I saw the ride back in 2000 in Universal Studios and it was definitely worth seeing, but was essentially stuck in the time capsule of 89-90. Really good, but the game brought a fresh lease of life to the franchise. And now, Back to the Future, the musical, where yours truly would meet the baby boomer man responsible in part for bringing us the franchise. And the audience could be ever so slightly better behaved than the audience from the boomers' beloved cowboy era. So straight up, I f***ing liked it. I thought I'd like it, but it exceeded my expectations. Great on-stage special effects, a very immersive and energetic performance. Just a great rendition of the original movie.
I thought I told you never to come in here.
Put into the format of a musical theatre performance in my hometown of London, which the Yanks believe is a place of Victorian magic and wonder.
London's a magical place.
Yeah, if you've got big money. I really loved the way they adapted the 80s scenes, but like with a new twist. Plus the 50s scenes were like the original, but sprinkled with a bit of Grease and Happy Days. Like the Top Gun sequel, the audience were mainly Gen Xers in their early 50s, reliving their youth, I'm afraid to say in more ways than one. Only this was way better than Top Gun 2 in my opinion. The guy who played the Doc was the highlight for me. His slightly hammy yet zesty performance matched with his comic timing actually made his take on the Doc Brown its own thing, and not just a Christopher Lloyd impression.
Dr. Emmett Brown?
Now in terms of Bob Gale, as well as original composer Alan Silvestri being there, I happened to go on the night where it was the last night for some of the original cast except for the Doc, which was bittersweet because I enjoyed all of their performances, especially George McFly. Yes, George McFly. The character originally played by none other than Crispin Glover, the eccentric anxious dude who ended up having a long-term feud with the man who was in attendance on the night I went to the musical, Bob the Baby Boomer Gale.
Michael J. Fox, Christopher Lloyd, Leah Thompson, and an absolutely incredible movie cast.
Nothing for you, nothing for you.
So during the intermission, right, I saw Bob Gale 2 rows down and he was just talking to one person. I'm like, F it, let me talk to him right now. I went up to him, I asked him, is George McFly suing for using his likeness? He laughed and said, well, I wrote George McFly. So I said, oh, it was you that wrote him. Because, you know, like, Back to the Future was co-created by him and Zemeckis, not just him. So then he said something like, yeah, he's written, he's not actually real. Then I immediately just said to him, okay, did you write the character that is not real? Then we both paused like it's going to turn into some awkward, uptight, negative interaction. So I just tried to shift gears. I was like, okay, I love the show. You come often to see the show. He said, no, I live in California. I'm like, cool, can I have a photo? The guy was nice enough to oblige and shake my hand. I promise you I wasn't trying to get into like an ego competition with Bob Gale. It just went that way. My thing is this. I can see how Bob Gale and Crispin Glover could get into some kind of thing. Basically, their personalities simply wouldn't mesh. They had some feud on set, then they didn't bring Glover back for the sequel because he asked for too much money. They used Glover's likeness for the aged prosthetics on another actor in the second picture, then Glover sued. Okay, Gale is an ideas man, not a manager of personalities, so naturally he's going to struggle to maneuver an eccentric Burt like Glover.
I can kick.
But Glover consistently cries and slanders Gale. Years later,
Well, Bob Gale blames the person of his illegal action for his illegal action.
to the point where he just comes off like a bitter, egocentric rabble-rouser.
Should hold Bob Gale accountable for it.
It's like, move on, bruv.
Bob Gale, Bob Gale still... I didn't think that there should have been monetary, the kind of clothes we were... It all pointed toward this idea that happiness was about wealth.
No, bozo. Monetary success is the obvious symbolic example everybody understands. Back to the Future is not subliminal propaganda for excessive material consumption or consumer capitalism, whatever.
Oh, drama queen.
I wasn't even going to touch on this feud, but my brief encounter with Gale expanded my perspective. Ultimately, these two, personality-wise, were destined to clash.
Thank you.
Bob Gale,
Gale is not necessarily socially awkward, but socially out of sync.
Thank you.
And Glover's just been spurging out over their feud for the past 30, 40 years.
Bob Gale,
Thank you. And an absolutely incredible movie cast.
Nothing for you.
Bob Gale,
Back to the Future is one of the best trilogies ever, after maybe the Before trilogy and the original Star Wars trilogy before Lucas besmirched them. Godfather, well, we all know what happened there.
No, Dad.
The first is undeniably great. The sequels are good, but go down as some of the best time travel stories ever, alongside the all-time greats.
I am the guardian of forever.
Why does Spock call you Captain?
Let's just get the DeLorean ready and get the hell out of here.
Let's get the hell out of here.
The Hollywood studio machine not turning the franchise into cinematic recycled French fries is the greatest homage you could ever pay to this saga, which was of course down to the indefatigable resistance of a certain creative duo from the controversial mummy and daddy generation.
There's never going to be a Back to the Future Part 4.
My boomer piece of shit parents.
You.
Yes, we all get old, and yes, some of us get bold,
Jesus, didn't that guy ever have hair?
but we can still go back to the future. If you've made it to the conclusion of the series, well, thank you very much. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.